One of these put prostitutes on the government payroll to lure ordinary men into rented apartments, then dosed their drinks with LSD while agents watched through one-way glass and filmed everything. Another asked in writing whether the agency could take total control of a human being until he would do its bidding against his will. And a third was a typed, page-numbered manual that taught interrogators how to take a person apart from the inside. These were not rumors. They were funded, signed, and stamped secret, then buried for decades. Tonight, we open 8 more files. Real operations, real victims, real money. They hid behind respectable names until a hearing or a court ruling dragged them into the light. The first file begins in a San Francisco apartment behind a mirror that was not really a mirror. File 1, Operation Midnight Climax. In the mid-1950s, I wanted to know what happened to a human mind when it was secretly dosed with LSD, with no warning and no consent. So under the larger MKOFTEN program, run for the agency by Sidney Gott, an officer named George Hunter White set up safe houses in San Francisco that were really traps. Prostitutes were paid with government money to bring ordinary men back to these apartments. And there, the men's drinks were spiked with LSD while the drug took hold. Agents watched through one-way glass and recorded what they saw. The victims were everyday people who had simply walked through the wrong door, and they were never told what had been done to them. The operation ran for years before it was quietly shut down. The full picture only surfaced in the 1970s, when the Church Committee in the 1977 Senate MKOFTEN hearings forced the agency to admit, alongside George White's own financial records and safe house documents, the government had built brothels to drug its own citizens for science. The next file shows where the idea began. File 2, Project Artichoke. Before the safe houses, before the spiked drinks, there was a question written down on paper. In a 1952 memorandum, the agency asked whether it could get control of an individual to the point where he would do its bidding against his will, even against the most fundamental laws of nature, like self-preservation. Artichoke, which grew out of an earlier effort called Bluebird, was the agency's first formal mind control program, and it set out to answer that question using hypnosis, drugs, and total isolation. This was the Cold War brainwashing fear written as an official objective, the literal blueprint behind every story Americans whispered about enemies who could turn a man into a weapon against himself. The program's existence and its chilling language survived in declassified memos held in the reading room and the National Security Archive, and it was later folded into the broader record exposed by the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission. A government had asked, on the record, whether it could erase a person's free will. The next file shows what happened when that idea was turned into a teaching manual. File 3, the KUBARK Interrogation Manual. In July 1963, produced a secret instruction manual on how to interrogate a resistant human being. It was not a vague set of suggestions, it was a typed, page-numbered curriculum. Damn secret that taught interrogators how to deliberately induce what it called psychological regression, breaking down an adult's sense of self until he became dependent and compliant. The methods it described included sensory deprivation, isolation, and the careful use of dread, all aimed at dismantling a prisoner's will rather than simply asking him questions. The document treated the human mind as a lock to be picked, and it laid out the procedure in cold, clinical language. The manual stayed hidden for more than 3 decades. It was declassified in 1997.
With a fuller release following in 2014, and it is now held by the National Security Archive at George Washington University.
By then, its ideas had not stayed in 1963. Many of the same concepts of isolation and sensory manipulation echoed in interrogations carried out long after the Cold War ended. The next file crosses the ocean to a court that ruled on 5 techniques. File 4, the 5 techniques the men history remembers as the hooded men. In 1971, during internment in Northern Ireland, the British Army selected a group of detainees and subjected them to what became known as the 5 techniques. They were hooded so they could not see. They were forced into painful stress positions for long stretches. They were exposed to a constant droning white noise, and they were deprived of sleep, food, and water. Some of the men were reportedly chosen for their physical fitness, almost as if they were being tested rather than questioned. When the matter reached an international court, British authorities were accused of misleading the proceedings about a hidden interrogation center where the methods were applied. In 1978, the European Court of Human Rights delivered its judgment in the case known as Ireland versus the United Kingdom, and the affair was examined in the Parker and Compton inquiries at home.
The story did not end there. From 2014, new disclosures in declassified British files reopened the case.
And the same 5 techniques resurfaced in arguments about interrogation far beyond that decade. A democracy had written hooding and exhaustion into a method. The next file returns to America and to something far stranger than drugs.
File 5, Project MKOFTEN. By the late 1960s, the search to control the human mind had branched into territory that sounds impossible to take seriously.
Except that it was real and funded. MKOFTEN was a joint and Army program that screened large numbers of drugs on test subjects, including prisoners and soldiers, tied to as Office of Research and Development and the Army's Edgewood arsenal. That part was grim but expected. The part that was not expected is that the program also quietly turned to the occult. Investigators later found that MKOFTEN reached out to astrologers, self-described witches, and students of the paranormal, exploring whether anything in that world could be turned into a tool of espionage. Cold War fear of falling behind had pushed a government agency to ask whether ghosts, omens, or hidden powers might win a war. The whole effort, named alongside related projects, was dragged into public view by the Church Committee and the 1977 Senate Joint Hearing on Mankultra. A nation had spent real money chasing both chemistry and sorcery. The next file shows where this hunger for a truth drug actually started. File 6, Project Chatter. The American obsession with a chemical that could unlock a person's secrets did not begin with it began with the Navy, and it began by reading the work of the Nazis after the Second World War.
Captured German reports described mescaline experiments carried out on prisoners at the Dachau concentration camp.
Lethal tests on people who could not refuse. Instead of treating that as a warning, the United States Navy saw a lead. In 1947, it launched Project Chatter at the Naval Medical Research Institute in Bethesda. Program built to find a so-called truth drug under a physician named Charles Savage. The Navy tested substances including mescaline and LSD, and among the people exposed were its own military patients, including men being treated for depression. The program ran into the early 1950s before it was wound down. Its existence was later documented through congressional oversight, most clearly in the 1977 Senate hearings that mapped out the web of mind control program. A Navy had taken a page from a death camp and tried it on its own sailor. The next file leaves the laboratory behind and aims at entire nation. File 7, Project Camelot. Not every attempt to control the human mind worked on one person at a time. Some aimed at whole societies. In 1964, the United States Army, working through the Special Operations Research Office at American University, launched Project Camelot. Its goal was to recruit social scientists and use their research to model how revolutions and internal wars begin, so that the military might learn to predict them and even shape them in other countries. The work was dressed up as ordinary academic study, but its true purpose was strategic. Chile was lined up as an early real-world test case when researchers in Latin America began to understand what the project was really for. The reaction was furious. When the controversy reached Washington, the program was examined in congressional hearings associated with Senator William Fulbright, and the Department of Defense officially canceled Camelot on July 8, 1965. A government had tried to turn the study of human society into a weapon for steering it. The last file tonight is the eeriest of all because it weaponized the dead. File 8, Operation Wandering Soul, remembered for its centerpiece, Ghost Tape number 10. During the Vietnam War, United States Army Psychological Operations units understood that fear could be a weapon, and they aimed it at a deep cultural belief. In Vietnamese tradition, a person who dies far from home without a proper burial may become a restless wandering soul trapped between worlds. So Army PsyOps engineers built recordings designed to sound like exactly that. The wailing voices of dead soldiers, calling out as if from beyond the grave, begging the living to lay down their arms and go home before they too died unburied in the jungle. At night, these recordings were broadcast through loudspeakers, some mounted on vehicles and helicopters, sending ghostly cries drifting across the dark. The intent was to terrify enemy fighters into abandoning the fight by turning their own sacred beliefs against. The effort is documented in declassified Army PsyOps materials archived at the US Army Heritage and Education Center. And remarkably, the actual Ghost Tape number 10 audio still survives in the public domain. An army had recorded the dead and played them back as a weapon. 8 more files, and everyone aimed at the same target. the human mind, a drugged, unwitting men behind one-way glass, then asked in writing whether it could own a person's will. An army hooded detainees until they broke. A program chased both new drugs and the occult. A navy borrowed from a death camp. One project tried to engineer revolutions, another to weaponize the dead. These are only the experiments we know about, because a hearing or a court survived long enough to be read. The mind was treated as a thing to be opened and used. Come back when the next file is declassified.